Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Hat Historian, in my new filming location. In this slightly different video, rather than talking about a specific hat as I usually do, I will instead be examining why so few people wear hats today when they were very common, almost indispensable in the past. In this day and age, wearing a hat, other than fairly utilitarian ones for practical reasons, such as a baseball cap for the sun, a knit hat for the cold, or some kind of helmet for protection, is relatively uncommon. However, one just has to see old movies or pictures from the mid-20th century on back to see in those days almost everybody, men and women, and children, wore some kind of hat or cap whenever they were outdoors. Someone wearing a hat will usually attract some attention today, and will be seen as making a bold fashion choice. There are of course exceptions, and many of them, but on the whole, the wearing of hats day to day went into sharp decline in the West around the 1960s, and the rest of the world soon followed. So let us see why that might be. To understand why people no longer wear hats like they once did, one should first look at why hats were worn in the first place. The original and basic purpose of a hat, and why they were developed at all, is to protect the head, be it from the elements like the sun, rain, or cold, or from injuries in battle or at work. I've mentioned before that examples of fur hats worn by prehistoric men have been found, and representation of wide-brimmed straw or felt hats exist as far back as the ancient Greeks at least. Thus, the hat was originally an eminently practical piece of gear, and for the vast majority of people for centuries remained nothing more. However, humans also tend to be vain creatures who like to show off, no different than peacocks flashing their bright feathers. We like to look good, and if possible, decorate our attire with colors and patterns to stand out. Furthermore, people in authority want to look impressive and be recognizable, and let there be no doubt as to their exalted status. The head being the highest and most important part of the body, it was one of the main parts that got adorned whenever people wished to project style or power. Regular work hats could be enhanced with patterns woven into them, or tassels or feathers to add a certain flair, and of course chieftains and kings have worn crowns and headdresses since ancient times. These crowns, be they made of gold, silk, feathers, or any other precious material, were often too tall and heavy to be truly practical, so they simultaneously showed the wealth of the wearer, enhanced his or her physical height, and demonstrated they were above the need for lowly physical labor. As time went on, not only kings but other nobles used their headwear as a status symbol. It was an integral part of an outfit, and no nobleman or woman would dare be seen out in public without suitable headwear. And for commoners, the vast majority of which worked outdoors, no matter where in the world, the importance of a practical cap or bonnet to keep warm or protect from the sun was not to be underestimated. They wore hats out of necessity, but then became something of a marker of where you were from, each region developing its own peculiar shape based on the climate, available materials, and general trends of fashion, with wool or felt being common in Western Europe, straw in Southern Europe or Africa, fur being preferred in Scandinavia, Russia, or Inuit lands, cotton in many places in the Middle East and North Africa, or abundant bamboo being the choice in much of Asia. The physical properties of these materials informed to some extent how the hats were shaped, as did the needs of the wearers, with ear flaps developing in colder climates, short visors over the face in rainy ones, large brims in sunny ones, and ventilated frames in very hot and humid ones. However practical, or sometimes not, a hat's purpose is, another fundamental force guiding their appearance and wearing is that of fashion. Clothing, hairstyles, and, yes, hats, are areas where people have always wanted to follow the latest trend, and while sometimes slow to trickle down from the upper to lower classes, or from one country to another, fashion trends have long influenced what hat is worn depending on social status. Oftentimes, styles begin at the top and then are slowly adopted in simpler form by lower and lower classes that wish to give themselves a sophisticated air. Then styles will even transfer over to the military, where they will become representative of the nation fielding it. Sometimes, for differing reasons, a particular country's style will become fashionable, influencing its neighbors. This is notable of places such as Spain in the Americas during the colonial period, Italy, Britain, or France, and differing period from the late 15th to 19th centuries in the West, or China and Asia, and of course the United States in the 20th century. Oftentimes, the influence a country has on fashion correlates to its power on the world stage. Finally, one major reason many people wear headwear can be for their religion. Several beliefs recommend, if not require, its adherents to cover their head, oftentimes for men as a symbol of submission to God, or for women as a form of modesty. Muslim and Christian women have for centuries worn headscarves or bonnets to hide their hair, for example, and Jewish or Sikh men would wear coverings like the kippah, which I've mentioned before, or a turban. How much the head covering is worn, of course, depends on how devout the practitioner is, with many Jewish people only wearing a kippah and Orthodox women a headscarf when at a religious service, while many Sikh men and many Muslim women wear their head covering daily. The examining of these various reasons hats are worn all come together to explain why many don't do it anymore. The simple fact is that there is no single reason, but rather a general concurrence of reasons that explain it and why it happened when it did. And while nobody can pinpoint a single moment or event that caused people to stop wearing hats, there are many probable reasons. The decline in hat wearing is generally traced back to the mid-20th century in Western countries, culminating in the early 1960s when they had almost completely vanished. Several things happened in this era that contributed to it. One major factor was the popularization of the automobile. In the United States alone, car ownership went from less than 1% in 1920 to 1 in 4 in 1940 to over half by the 60s. This influenced how people dressed, as before they had to walk, ride, or take public transportation to get wherever they were going, thus exposing themselves regularly to the elements for extended periods of time. A hat, therefore, was a very practical item to wear. But with the advent of enclosed cars that people could take directly from home to their destination, they no longer needed such protection, and furthermore tended to have low ceilings, so a hat couldn't be comfortably worn inside them, forcing any wearer to take it off anyways. Though according to legend, London taxis were, and it is said still are, designed to be tall enough for a gentleman to ride in one without needing to take off his top hat. Add to that there was an ever-increasing number of people who worked in climate-controlled offices in cities, and there was a whole class who rarely exposed themselves to the elements and would therefore not need protection from them, so would never need a hat. They just became an encumbrance, something you needed to check for a fee whenever you went inside a theater, for example. With this practical reason removed, all that remained to keep people wearing hats was the force of fashion, and we all know how changeable that can be. Of course, not everyone could afford a car, and in rural areas many still worked outdoors, which is why hats tended to endure longer amongst working and rural classes. But even then, there was a trend to not wear them, as going hatless could be a sign of a successful man, one who owned a car, and everybody wanted to look successful, further spreading the practice. But the removal of its practical applications is only one part of the story, as wearing a hat was also a social norm, expected, as it were, and it took time for it to be fully acceptable to forego it. Another explanation that is given, not in conflict but in addition to the effect of cars, was the one World War II had on young people, especially young men. In the army, they were forced to wear hats at almost all times, as uniform regulation, then as mostly now, demands that you wear a cover, as headgear is known in military parlance, whenever out of doors. After an entire generation spent many years adhering to the rigid dress codes of military life, there was something of a backlash against them once they became civilians again. The Hat Research Foundation, which did actually exist, conducted a survey in 1947, which reported that 1 in 5 men who didn't wear hats stated their reason as they were made to do so in the army, and now they weren't soldiers anymore, they didn't want to. Women also joined in the trend, as even though most were in the military, many went to work in factories, a la Rosie the Riveter, and got used to wearing practical work clothes, some of which they kept after the war, albeit in a minority, without the elaborate hats of old. Building on this was also the rise of youth culture, or should I say counterculture, after the war. Teenagers and young adults developed their own styles that often rejected the old social norms. While some form of youth counterculture had always existed, it became more codified and visible through popular culture and media. This was the age of rock and roll and rebels without a cause. They embraced less formal manners of dress, and as a part of that, wearing hats like their parents was definitely inconceivable. This mostly started in the United States, though through the movies popular at the time very quickly spread to Europe. Young trendy people did not wear hats in this new, less formal era. It is sometimes said that the man who put an end to hat wearing was President John F. Kennedy, who famously at the time preferred to go hatless, and who was seen as a young, energetic, inspiring president whom people sought to emulate. And while it was true that the president often has a certain influence on trends, and Kennedy did prefer not to wear a hat and thus probably contributed to their decline in style, he was probably more of a symptom of the trend than the cause. As early as the 1950s, a decade before Kennedy became president, fewer and fewer people, especially in the younger generations, were wearing them, and some newspapers bemoaned what they thought was a fad rather than a permanent trend. So Kennedy was in many ways more representative of his time, a president of a new hatless era, rather than the man that killed hats. Women, for their part, began to fight for equal rights with the women's liberation movements in the 1960s. Freeing themselves from old constraints, they abandoned the more stilted styles of previous generation in favor of relaxed, even provocative ones at times, and the prim and proper hats they used to wear, even the relatively easy-to-wear cloche ones of the Jazz age, had little place in this new culture. All of these reasons, and undoubtedly many more, coalesce to cause a sharp decline in hat wearing that is evident in any photo comparison of crowds between the late 1940s and mid-1960s. This trend started mostly in America and Western Europe. However, being the motors of popular and youth culture, they rapidly influenced the rest of the world, with the old Soviet bloc retaining more conservative styles until the late 1980s, including hats and caps, and in fairness, many being relatively cold countries, some of these had a practical use too, as well as Latin America. Asia's quick modernization and urbanization led to many people discarding their traditional rural hats and adopting more international, i.e. Western styles. The same is true in Africa. Of course, the change was gradual, with older generations holding on in some cases to older styles, but it was noticeable. By the turn of the millennium, hat wearing was a shadow its former self, rare and conspicuous when seen. Even many uniformed services, such as police or customs, have abandoned the wearing of hats. And this might shock you, but even I, who enjoy wearing them, also often go without a hat when I have no reason to wear one, even though I wear one probably way more frequently than the average population. I should note, as always, that there are exceptions, and that, as my channel demonstrates repeatedly, while hat wearing is rarer than it once was, it is not completely extinct. And while I'll list some, covering every last exception would take hours, so people can fill in the comments. While religious sentiment and the hats associated with them diminished strongly in developed countries after World War II, forms of headwear are still worn by many devout in other regions and groups, notably Sikhs who wear turbans, some Muslims who wear taqiyas, a form of skullcap, Orthodox Jews who wear black fedoras or kippas, or Mennonites who wear bonnets. And hats are worn in some places in a mix of practical and cultural reasons. In the Middle East, many men wear the keffiyeh or its variants, as it protects from the sun, though even the wealthy, who are rarely exposed to it, do it as part of their formal wear. In Asia, straw hats are still worn by many who work outdoors in the same way as they have for centuries. And this shows a trend true of many regions in the world that rural workers wear hats more than urban ones, for the simple reason that they are more exposed to the elements. A notable holdout in the United States is the cowboy hat, which of course is used for practical reasons by ranchers throughout North America, but has a deep cultural attachment in the western US that means it is worn by many who have never been within a shouting distance of a cow. A similar practical and cultural attachment can be seen with a flat cap among Irish-descended people throughout the world. Hats are naturally also often worn for purely practical reasons. Knit caps or fur hats are extremely common in winter and cold climates for the simple expedient of protecting oneself, and they are often decorated in various ways, the knit cap being by far the most common, as it is warm and can easily be stuffed in a pocket when not used. Conversely, in the sun, many women in particular wear straw sun hats, and of course one cannot talk about modern hats without mentioning the only hat that hasn't suffered from the decline, the baseball cap. Over 3/4 of hats sold today are baseball caps, which, as I mentioned, is a sun hat broken down to its most practical fundamental elements, a skull cap with a visor. From sports to uniforms to workers to fashion, it is the most ubiquitous hat today, worn by men and women, and the only hat one is, for better for worse, likely to see daily in most places, having supplanted all others. More traditional hats endure in some formal events, though they are now mostly the attribute of enthusiasts and eccentrics who still enjoy them and the old-fashioned style they project. This image has sometimes been dented a bit, such as the fedora with the internet culture, but a good hat when worn well can still be a stylish accessory and is most definitely a conversation topic and, in this day and age, a way to stand out from a crowd in the same way that being hatless would have done a century ago. I unfortunately cannot predict the future, so cannot say if hats will ever return to the prominence they once had, though given current trends I'm not optimistic. However, I do not believe either that they are doomed to disappear altogether. Between cultural attachment, fashion statements, and the simple necessity to protect oneself from the elements, there will always be a place somewhere for a hat. So I hope you enjoyed this and will join me soon for another episode, and this time, for the historic reasons I've just discussed, I have no hat on my head I can tip to you, so for once, let's just say it's a thought that counts.